Thank you for tuning in to today's program with John Dean, one of our most astute presidential scholars of our most complicated presidential era. I'm Andrea Grossman, founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 25th year. I want to welcome John Dean back to Writer's Bloc. He has participated in so many great programs, including Barbara Boxer, Michael Moore, and Anyway, Bob Woodward. So, as you know, John Dean was White House counsel for Richard Nixon from 1970 to 1973, when he spoke truth to power, testified before Congress in what was electrifying testimony, and helped to pull the curtain down on the Nixon presidency. He did the right thing, and it couldn't have been easy. If anyone can attest to the danger of presidential malfeasance, it's John Dean. Much has been written about Donald Trump and his evolution from flirting with authoritarianism to all-out embrace. In his new book, Authoritarian Nightmare, John Dean does something different. He looks at the Trump base and studies what it is that some Americans love about an authoritarian leader. An authoritarian leader, after all, cannot exist without followers. So what compels people to follow an authoritarian? What personality traits do followers possess, and what keeps them tied to their leader? Why does the base continue to believe lies coming from the top? And specifically here in 2020, why is it that someone so corrupt would be so embraced? Authoritarian Nightmare offers a lot of answers and prompts many more as well. Go to our website, writersblockpresents.com, to get a link to Chevalier's books. John has signed book plates, which will be included in the books that you purchase. We're 63 days out from the election. You'll want to read this book. If you enjoy Writer's Block and what we do, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at writersblockpresents.com. to keep these programs going. I'm so delighted now to present John Dean.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to share screen immediately because I've got a little PowerPoint that I assembled for this occasion. Let me find it. Here we are. I think that's got the full screen for you. By way of preface, I thought I'd start with a study that I was not privy to or party to, but came out shortly before my book did. And I knew one of the participants, Larry Diamond, who's at Stanford. It was a voter study group analysis over a 3-year period of attitudes on authoritarianism in America. And it's pretty startling stuff. Americans, of course, overwhelmingly love their democracy. But that overwhelming love kind of masks some really troubling truths when you dig in, as this study did. For example, 1 in 3 say a strong leader is a good way to run a country. 1 in 4 say they would favor army rule in America. This is as of June 2020. Fewer than half Americans would object to a president acting unilaterally that should be without constitutional or congressional authority. 41% say it's appropriate for a president to act unilaterally because, quote, a large majority of the American people believe he should act. I don't know if this is a lack of civic education or indeed it is the kind of personalities that my collaborator and I we're studying. It may be a little of both. But I think this preface tells us there is definitely a severe sympathy for authoritarianism in the population. Authoritarianism, we could spend the whole session discussing it. I kind of thought a quickie is the Oxford English Dictionary on Wikipedia. This describes it as the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. I don't really deal with that aspect, the political science aspect of it. Rather, I deal with the personality aspect of it. And authoritarianism in our terms it's the relationship of followers to leaders. Stripped to its essentials, authoritarianism happens when followers submit too much to their authoritarians in their lives. Now, what's too much? Well, that's obviously open to a lot of definitions and descriptions. Lying, cheating, and stealing may be too much for some to let their leaders get away with it. Others, that doesn't trouble them. Ruling by undemocratic means and undermining democracy, that doesn't trouble them so much either, I discovered as I dug into this subject. By way of the political science side, I would recommend anybody who's interested in this subject look at Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's some excellent books. A quickie read on Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. There's some others that I looked at all these along the way, but I decided that the more important aspect was to understand why these people believe as they do. I did enjoy the Dictator's Handbook, which is why bad behavior is always good politics. My first dive into this subject was over a decade ago when I did a book called Conservatives Without Conscience. That book was actually prompted by my relationship with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, whose son and I have been lifetime friends. We were roommates in prep school together and have remained close ever since. In fact, he introduced me to my wife, which he never lets me forget. He made a mistake in giving her up. Anyway, the senator was troubled by the fact that the religious right was taking over the conservative movement, and he didn't understand it. So we started on a project to try to dig out why that was happening. He got ill, the project got put on the shelf, but some years later I pulled it down during the Bush years and looked at it again and found the man who knew the most about this would later become my collaborator in this current project. And he was very helpful, Bob Altemeyer. He was at the time, he was a professor of psychology at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. He is an American born in St. Louis, but he has had pretty free reign, he said, up at Manitoba to do all the research he wanted to do. And he has specialized in studying and exploring authoritarianism. When Trump arrived on the scene, we both were scratching our heads as to why so few mainstream journalists were writing anything in depth about Trump's authoritarianism. There was one piece that would appear during the primaries. It was done by Amanda Taub for Vox. It was called The Rise of American Authoritarianism. And she described in the subtitle, or the editors did, a niche group of political scientists may have uncovered what's driving Donald Trump's ascent. What they found has implications that go well beyond 2016. That was an understatement. But what she had discovered was a sort of an offshoot of the main body of science on this that's based on a 4-question analysis of people's disposition towards or against authoritarianism based on child rearing, as Bob Altemeyer told me repeatedly, and we actually ended up putting an appendix in the book to explain how incomplete this analysis really is and how little it really tells you about authoritarianism. But yet, a number of journalists did pick this story up and go with it, so there was some hint during the campaign that we indeed had an authoritarian. His opponents in the primary certainly thought that. They called Trump a demagogue right out of the box. Lindsey Graham, Cruz called him a demagogue. Even Stephen Hawking called him a demagogue. It kind of came, no question, when the New York Times did a study of the first 95,000 words Trump had used during the campaign. They called in rhetoric specialists, they had political scientists, psychologists, and they concluded that he was indeed a full-blown demagogue. And then after, the D word became very common in the Times and other papers. was a little slower getting to the A word, authoritarianism. After, as the campaign proceeded and nothing was happening, I was having ongoing conversations with Bob Altemeyer up at Manitoba, and we were both sort of trying to figure out what we could do to get the mainstream to look at this body of science that had really started with the aftermath of World War II, when scientists up at Berkeley began examining, could it happen in the United States what had happened in Italy and Germany, where they had so easily fallen sway to a dictator. That was the beginning of the study of the authoritarian personality. I got Bob to join me in writing a column and then doing an interview in July of 2017, sort of the last piece we did on authoritarianism. And he was predicting that Trump would actually win the election. I didn't think there were enough authoritarians in existence to do so. As it turns out, he wins by a fluke, is what we explain in our book. So to pick this up and tell you what the body of science involves, there are three types of personalities that have emerged. There are the leaders, there are the followers, and there is a unique type of personality that has traits of both the leader and the follower, and they're some of the most troublesome personalities. Let's look at each quickly. The social dominance orientation scale is pretty clear. It typically involves men. It looks for dominating personalities and brings out in questionnaires and examinations. And in some instances, we have to rely, because people aren't going to sit down and take personality tests. But if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and does it all the time like a duck, it's probably a duck. So we have drawn that conclusion in some instances. But anyway, the social dominators have dominating personalities. I was going to give an overview first of all three. There are the authoritarian followers, which are determined based on what's called the right-wing authoritarian scale. Then there are the double highs, and they show traits of both leaders and followers, which is sort of oxymoronic, but it is a definite type personality. So you have these three personalities. Let's look at each of them briefly. As I was saying, the social dominators are dominating personalities. Richard Nixon is our last authoritarian president. We've had about 4 authoritarian presidents. If you use the definition of social dominance that's used by social science, Andrew Jackson would qualify, Woodrow Wilson would qualify, Richard Nixon qualifies, and Donald Trump is a poster boy. But anyway, the dominating personality, they believe in inequality. It is the only way they want life to proceed, either when they are in control or any group they're a part of, typically is riddled with inequality. And they're desirous of personal power. And finally, they are amoral. Those 4 criteria will give you a social dominator. We also have tests of them, things in the book referred to as the madman test and the conman test, and they show other interesting traits with the social dominators. They're intimidating and bullying, they're faintly hedonistic, they're vengeful, they're pitiless, they're exploitive, they're manipulative, they're dishonest, they'll cheat to win, they're highly prejudiced, racist, sexist, homophobic, they're mean-spirited, militant, nationalistic. Sounds like somebody we might know. So here are the 4 criteria of the social dominators: Jackson, Wilson, Nixon, Trump. So this is not a new phenomenon. That's what I just went through. These people are really, however, somewhat fools on a soapbox as demagogues until they get followers. And not all of them do, some of them do. And the followers have been the focus of most of the social science study. In fact, when I was writing back in 26 and 7, actually researching it in 2005, the social domination orientation had only recently been released and shown. So it's a little over a decade that social scientists have really been looking at the social dominators, because most of the focus has been on the followers. That's where we have the most science. As a result of Hitler and Mussolini and the crowds and people they attracted of their own free will, as I say, a group went up to Berkeley and started to try to analyze these people and put out their first work in 1951 on the authoritarian personality. This study was controversial, and actually it had a life of about a decade, but it was based largely on a lot of Freudian psychology and had its own weaknesses. But the personality was believed to be there, so other social scientists picked it up, not using Freudian psychology or any sort of economic approach to it, but rather just testing personalities and developing personality tests, found that there were these people called right-wing authoritarians. This wasn't a label used to find conservatives, although conservatives certainly do score high on it. It was a reference, Altemeyer tells me, who was responsible for the initial label on the scale, that he was thinking in the Old English term of right, W-R-I-T, and in other words, correct with authority was the image he had, and he said it was a mistake to use this label. Had he to redo it, he would have picked another one, because there also can be left-wing authoritarians. In fact, he used the right-wing authoritarian scale in Russia and found that those who were loyal to the Communist Party were actually right-wing authoritarians, while we would see them as left. And this was true in some socialist countries as well, where it's been used. So it's a little bit confusing politically if you look at it that way. This is just for my review to tell you what these people do. They are submissive to authority, and then they are aggressive. Excuse me. I couldn't find a good picture of submissive to authority, and this fellow just struck me as totally submissive. They are aggressive on behalf of authority. This is not unsurprising when you have demagogues and authority figures. Trump has pushed this pretty far with his willingness to take care of legal bills of people who get overly aggressive on his behalf. And they're also, if you look at them closely, very conventional. They're the people who do not stand out in a crowd typically. Additional testing reveals them to be highly religious. They have moderate to little education. They trust untrustworthy authorities. They're prejudiced, particularly against homosexuals, women, and followers of religions other than their own. They are mean-spirited. They're narrow-minded. They're intolerant. They're bullying. They're zealous. They're dogmatic. They're uncritical of their chosen authority. They're hypocritical. They're inconsistent and contradictory. In fact, we explain in the book at some length their ability to hold inconsistent thoughts and how they are able to compartmentalize information they don't want as well as that they do want. They have virtually no skills in critical thinking. It's really quite remarkable, some of these people, when they are, some of these follow-up tests are given to them. They are highly self-righteous, they're moralistic, they're strict disciplinarians, they're severely punitive, they demand loyalty and return it, they have little self-awareness. So while those traits have appeared consistently and reappeared in test after test. They don't define and describe every single person. Some may have some traits and not others. But by and large, if you find a prototypical right-wing authoritarian, he will or she will have all those traits. To test this science that had been in existence with the right-wing authoritarians for almost 5 decades of science, but it had been done with relatively small samples, some of it in Canada, some of it in university towns around the United States. Some had been done in state legislatures throughout the United States, but they were, as I say, relatively small samples. So while these were recognizable traits in the Trump base that we found, we took some risk because we were also planning to test this on a national basis with a poll. I happen to know the man who's founded and runs the Monmouth University Polling Institute, which is one of the better polling institutes. They, both in the last several presidential elections, Pat Murray has been the public face of Monmouth, which has done a remarkably good job on their polling and is one of the few that Nat Silver gives a gold star to. I think he has 5 in his site where he collates multiple polls, particularly for the approval ratings, and he has always said that Monmouth is one of the best in the business. Anyway, in working with them, we first did a sample in New Jersey where they're based, and that was about 900 people. We did that sample to refine what was really a personality survey, where they would take personality scales and tests and see where they fell politically based on those tests. And we, after trying telephone, in person, all methods, Monmouth came up with a very good platform to do an online survey. We then moved to a 2-phased national test, and it was done in late November and early October, drawing from about 225,000 people. We got down to what turned out to be 990 former voters and prospective voters, people who plan to vote in this coming election. And we skewed it a little bit towards the Republican end because we wanted to make sure we had a good analysis of Trump's base. That was a eureka moment for Bob Altemeyer, because the poll came back and the studies came back and the survey came back excuse me, and confirmed a lifetime of work for him in the strongest terms, more than he could have thought. But maybe the most telling feature of the poll was the fact that Trump has assembled a coalition of maybe the most prejudiced Americans. It is a base of the biased. The prejudice just stands out in this poll, the racism, the homophobia. And these are people who are, they're obviously not identified by name, so they're anonymous in taking this, but they're telling it the way, and these were all cross-checked by their answers, the way they felt. And the Trump base is, first of all, highly biased, highly prejudiced, but also deeply authoritarian. They are a combination of social dominators, not as many of those, but it's still a very high number, and right-wing authoritarian followers. Now, I said there was a third type of personality, and that's where people score high as both social dominators and right-wing authoritarians. The reason that's rare is because the dominator is sane and taking the right-wing authoritarian scale is that he's submissive too, which seems, as I say, oxymoronic. But the reason they do that is because when they take that right-wing authoritarian scale to see what kind of follower they are, they're thinking of other people following them. These people come up with some really nasty additional personality traits. I go into those in the book. I actually put a little table of them together because they're pretty unattractive. What was stunning about the poll, the Monmouth survey, if you will, is how many double highs appeared in the Republican Party. It seems they've all gone there to roost. That's not a healthy sign. So, the book is designed to not be sensational, but I am one who appreciates all these sensational books that are coming out, and I can now explain why his followers are not going to react to any of this. The lesson for the election is, while a few of these people are unhappy when they're told their natures, most of them are not. The social dominators, they're proud to be prejudiced. They're proud to be racist. They're the people who are driving these vans down Van Nuys Boulevard and have the Trump flags. They're the people who are in the cavalcades in Portland. They're the people who are causing problems in Kenosha, and they're going to keep doing it. But they're also they're joined by the double highs who will provoke them on and back them up. So we to defeat these people in the election, one of the reasons we did this book is anybody who's trying to persuade the Trump people, that 35 to 40% who are always approve everything he does, they're not going to be persuadable. They're going to stay right where they are. And the only remedy is a tsunami election, where indeed they get the picture that their disrespect for democracy, their belief in this man who is a norm-busting, democracy-weakening character, just won't be tolerated. They'll get that message. They understand that. But they're not persuadable. So we're wasting our time if we go there. So with that, I think we'll open this up for questions. I'll bring Andrea back in by going out of the share screen, and she can come back on, and said she's accumulated a few.
I have accumulated a few.
It's a silent audience, isn't it? Very quiet audience.
Yeah, that's so unusual for writer's block.
I kind of like it, actually.
Well, I miss, a lot of the really active, engaged audience that Writer's Block has.
It's true. Having done so many of them.
Yeah. So my first question is this. Is the right-wing authoritarian trait something that is found universally among all different nations and continents? Is it essentially a genetic trait?
Yes. It's not known if it's nature or nurture that creates these personalities. Altemeyer, who has dealt with this for a lifetime and a full career, thinks it probably is more nurture than nature, but there's a disposition that the parenting influences and results in these personalities emerging. But yes, they are found throughout the world. And
well, you showed these photos that are so familiar to us. The Korea photos, the Hitler and Mussolini photos. I mean, I would worry that it's more that it's less nurture than nature. Actually, don't you think?
As I say, science doesn't have a definitive answer. And I can only tell you what my expert, Altemeyer, felt. That, in fact, we didn't know Mary Trump, obviously, was writing the book she was writing. In the first few chapters of the book, we sort of lay out the background of Donald Trump such as it can be gathered. He doesn't like to talk about his youth. He doesn't really want to look back. He tries to suppress it. But yet, with working with some of his biographers, Tony Schwartz the first, and a few others, he He's revealed a little bit of himself, and we found that material. The best digging into his background, however, was done once he won the election. The Washington Post put a team of investigative reporters, and they really went back up into Queens and all of his former childhood friends and what have you, and prepared a very good book about him and his growing up. The most dominant thing that we found and report in our book is exactly what Mary Trump reports as a family member, and it's the tremendous influence of his father, of Fred Trump, on his son Donald, and how he was the chosen one for his son, by his father, and how he's never taken responsibility any time in his life, and how he was able. She didn't look at him developing the traits that an authoritarian personality develops. Altemeyer added that. That was our angle on it. But she certainly corroborates, and we certainly corroborate her on the fact of the dominant influence of the father on Donald Trump.
So do authoritarian leaders have a real ideology, or are they just power mad?
A few, I just based on my own reading, I know some have come in with ideologies that they want to impose. Donald Trump obviously had no ideology. He was a blank slate. He didn't even believe he would win the election. He was on a branding exercise. It's stunning. He has no plans for his second term. He was asked by Peter Baker of the New York Times recently. He was asked by Sean Hannity even before that, what were his plans for the second term? He has none. He cannot articulate any. To Hannity, he said, well, experience is what counts, and went off on a riff on experience. He didn't even get that far with Peter Baker. So this is a man with no ideology, and that's somewhat typical of authoritarians. Their ideology is their personality and their own desire to be in charge, and whatever it takes is going to be what drives their actions. They're surprisingly intuitive. There is no evidence whatsoever that Donald Trump has any idea about this body of science on the type of personality he is appealing to and his own personality. But intuitively, these people know how to read a crowd, know how to read their feelings. We found in researching the book that some of the things like the wall, he'd actually floated versions of those as early as 2000, where he just stumbled into it in a speech he was giving in New Hampshire. He was a guest speaker at a Republican event, and the only real serious applause line he got was when he said, well, if what they should do is build a fence along the Mexican border. That sent his crowd wild. Well, that was he collected that, and that's the way most of his feelings have gathered. That's why he likes the rallies, because they give him instant feedback to his thinking, where he floats things and tests them. So that's handicapping him right now to sort of pre-test his thinking.
Does it matter what he says? His base still seems to cheer at everything he says. So I can't imagine that he would say anything that his base, disapproves of.
Well, they're not, as I mentioned in my PowerPoint, they have zero critical thinking skills. Not all of them. Some of them are obviously, I know some Trump voters who are highly critical of Trump. They wanted to vote for Trump, at least last time, because they wanted his tax plans, that he would let the Republicans, they've been cooking around on Capitol Hill for quite a while, and they were pretty convinced that Trump as president, they would be adopted. So they're all happy, and they didn't need the tax breaks, but they wanted them. And some of them I talked to are not so happy with Trump now, but these are not either authoritarians or social dominators. They're just greedy people.
Right. Here's an interesting question. With Biden making a statement over the weekend about condemning violence on both sides, he uses similar rhetoric that Trump used in Charlottesville. Do you, but in terms of there are good people on both sides, and Biden said, that the violence on both sides needs to stop. The question is that, do you believe that equating fascists with protesters who are fighting against this very fascism is dangerous? And doesn't this actually deal with, so doesn't this thinking actually normalize authoritarian tactics?
Well, I've stayed away from the word fascism. It's a word that has been abused and misused and is not terribly clear, and stick pretty much with authoritarianism, which is clear. While there are different types of authoritarianism in governmental context, in governing context, in the personality sense, we all recognize an authoritarian personality. It didn't take long to put that label on Trump. So it's not hard to recognize people who that behavior is acceptable to. And needless to say, people to whom an authoritarian personality is acceptable, it is not a large step to be accepting that kind of governing. But anyway, I stay away from the pejorative terms as best I can in discussing this. But I didn't hear Biden's remark that on both sides on violence were at fault. That is true, of course. Violence should be unacceptable for either sides. I'm in a couple chains of idea exchanging groups, and there's been a lot of talk recently about the violence and sort of a justification on both sides of their side. And as somebody else who was in the chain came in and said late today, is that any of us who are saying that violence is acceptable are certainly on the wrong track. It is unacceptable on all fronts. There is no justification or rationalization for it. And I thought Biden was pretty clear when he came out yesterday and made his statement about Trump's whole attitude towards violence and fanning the flames, that it was unequivocally wrong. He said if president, he would prosecute violence that was contrary to the law, that he would find no justification for it, and didn't try to make excuses for it in the statement I heard.
Okay. Let's see. What about QAnon and other neo-Nazi groups? Will they gain traction as authoritarian leadership becomes more accepted here?
If Trump is reelected, you can be sure those people are going to surface and be much more important in the dialogue. If he is defeated and it's overwhelming and there's a tsunami election, they're going to be driven back under the rock where they belong. And that's what we have to hope happens.
Yeah. And what happens to the congressional leaders, senators and, Congress people, Republicans who have spoken out against Trump, like Mitt Romney, for example, and, and the others who have, towed the line and let him be the Pied Piper. What happens to them if Biden wins?
Well, if Biden wins, I think that they will it's going to depend a lot on the size of the win. If it's a squeaker, I think we're going to have a lot of trouble that Biden wins by. One of the things that came up as we report in the book in our Monmouth survey was roughly 25% of the Trump supporters will tolerate him not leaving if he wants to say it's rigged and fight it. There are certainly legal limits on what he can do, but that doesn't mean he can't cause a lot of havoc. I think he is fairly desperate at this point. While I don't think Biden would authorize, I don't know the answer to this, I shouldn't say it, but if past is prologue, Biden isn't going to authorize a criminal inquiry into Donald Trump. Obama and Biden did not authorize a criminal investigation into the war crimes of Bush and Cheney, and they were certainly conspicuous. That's where I came up with the title Worse Than Watergate, because I didn't think Richard Nixon on his darkest day would authorize what they authorized in waterboarding and other war crimes. But anyway, I don't know what Biden would do. But I do know that Trump is in a lot of trouble. Cyrus Vance is not going to be reluctant to prosecute him. He once did a deal for his children that has cost him politically, and he hasn't forgotten that. So I think Trump's in a lot of trouble politically. If he's not in the White House, he's exposed. Maybe he moved to Florida because he thinks that Governor DeSantis won't extradite him to New York if he gets prosecuted.
So if he gets reelected, how do we effectively fight this progression of authoritarianism over the next 4 years?
It's going to, the what ifs are difficult, because if we knew what the composition of the Congress was, it's pretty certain the House is going to remain Democratic. There is a possibility, a good possibility, that the Senate is going to become Democratic as well. It won't be an overwhelming filibuster defeating majority, though. So the first issue that's come up is whether or not, if the Democrats control the Senate, they will abolish the filibuster so they can get something done. Some moderates are saying they don't want that to happen, and that if that's going to happen, they don't want the Democrats to control. Well, this is just craziness. So anyway, there are a lot of tough issues that have to be faced if the Democrats do win control. There's certainly not enough votes to impeach in the Senate. That takes 67 votes. There are just not enough seats in play that's going to happen, where they would have that check on Trump if he were somehow to squeak through and be there, but yet lose the Congress generally.
Let's look at Fox News for a second. They've created an entirely effective propaganda machine. And so how can the civilized world break through that bubble in order to connect with Fox viewers?
I don't watch a lot of Fox News. I occasionally, just for counter programming to see what they're doing, will turn them on. And sometimes I'm actually surprised that they have some less than outrageous programming on. There is no easy way to solve that problem other than more information that counter programs them and tells the truth and points out what they're doing. These aren't stupid people. I have not read Brian Stelter's book yet, but apparently he pierced the veil, if you will, and found a lot of these people at Fox News believe that Trump is a joke and he's dangerous. And so they actually have not lost their intelligence, and they're just so interested in making the money they're making that's blinding them to go ahead and keep doing what they're doing. There is always the possibility they might become responsible.
You showed a few examples of authoritarian presidents, including Richard Nixon, whom you knew well. But I thought he was more just corrupt rather than authoritarian. Can you describe the differences between Nixon's authoritarianism and Trump's?
Nixon was an authoritarian behind closed doors. Donald Trump is an authoritarian in the Rose Garden. Nixon was not a demagogue. He did not go out and rant and rave like Donald Trump will do. So Nixon was if we didn't have the tapes, we wouldn't know the extent of Nixon's authoritarianism. He was not a particularly dominating father with his daughters. He was not a particularly dominating... That's you.
It's me. And that was my brother who knows you're here today. I'm sorry.
That's all right. He was not a particularly dominating father. He was not a particularly dominating man as a manager. So the ranting and the domination you hear is a clenched teeth telling Haldeman, his chief of staff, or Ehrlichman, or Kissinger, his top aides, what he wants done, how he wants it done, the ruthlessness with which he's prepared to do it, how he is very knowledgeable about how the government works, unlike a Donald Trump, who has not even a good newspaper knowledge of how the government works. Nixon knew. He'd been in the House, he'd been in the Senate, he'd been vice president for 8 years. He understood the processes and how to pull the levers. That's something that Trump is only now figuring out. And I think his staff is worried about what he might do if he knew more than he knows. They don't educate him. Anonymous has not yet stepped forward, but he or she is still there watching. And I suspect others are, because they realize that he is a loose cannon and dangerous.
So, what can the average voter do besides vote to stop this move? Is there anything? I mean, you said we're not going to convince any of his base, of that 36 or 40%, whatever that percentage was, to change their minds. But is there anything else that
yes,
that we can
there
do?
There certainly is, and we talk about it in the book, and we appeal to all the young people we know. I am confident my granddaughters, who are all of voting age, will all vote, and that they will talk to their friends about voting. And it's really in our analysis, and I was doing CNN yesterday, and the head of the NAA was on just before I was on, and he was talking about their analysis of the vote, and it's just right where Bob Altemeyer and I came out, is it's the youth vote could really make the difference. They tend not to vote. They're lazy. They don't think it counts or will help, and yet they don't like Trump one scintilla over, generally speaking. And they could make this a tsunami election where he and his enablers are all washed out of the system, if you will. And so I'm doing my best to get the word to young people as to how important this is, to get commitments from them. And we all know young people. And I think that's where adults can spend a lot of time with young people who are not particularly savvy or interested, by giving them a little chat that this is important, and they've got to do it this time.
I have to say something about that. In 2008, when Obama ran, I thought the campaign was sort of run by kids. It was wonderful to see.
It was.
Yeah. So we can't cast aspersions on young people because they got Obama. They turned that.
Well, they did. I'm just talking statistically generally. They don't vote.
Okay.
Not that they haven't voted, and
right.
Maybe our senator and potential vice president will stimulate young people. She certainly is charismatic, and hopefully that will be one of her assignments, is to go out and stimulate the younger people to vote. Right.
One last question: Do you have any interesting intel on Roger Stone?
I've only met Roger Stone once, when he showed up at a book fair in Texas where I had a book, and he stood up. He'd gotten himself positioned in line to pull what he thought was a dirty trick, to ask me some outrageous question at the top of the line. Then he snuck off, and I had the mic, so I said, "Roger, come back to the microphone." This, I'm told, is on C-SPAN somewhere. And I made him take the answer, and I explained to the audience of Texas that this is a man who thinks that Lyndon Johnson's responsible for Jack Kennedy's assassination, amongst other theories. So I fully was managed to embarrass Roger, which was the reverse of what he had in mind, and that's the one dealing I've had with him. I think that with some voters, Trump's going to pay the price for what he did with Stone. Stone, who had professed his innocence, has recently withdrawn any efforts to fight his appeal, and so in essence has admitted his guilt, that he did lie and got away with it. And I think also there's a high probability that if a Biden administration is in place and the Democrats control the Senate and the House, that he's going to be called back before Congress. There's going to be further investigations. Democrats are not going to let this go. If Benghazi was really just a tragedy that the Republicans stretched into years of investigation, the Trump administration is worth a decade of investigations.
Will Trump get on that helicopter from the White House lawn and wave farewell if he loses?
I don't think so. I think Michael Cohen is right when he said that Trump is not going to willingly leave. What's interesting is that without getting into it, we could do a whole program on this. In fact, I'm reading a book on it, on Will He Go right now, which is interesting. There are legal restraints on what he can and can't do. He can fight it to a degree. What he's got to do is corrupt an awful lot of governors to overturn the election results and send electors who are contrary to the wish of the state. Now, that's going to be kamikaze actions by those governors, but that's the way only way he could overturn the election. If it's not resolved by January 8th, I guess it is, certainly by January 20th, but maybe it's as early as the 8th, but the 20th for sure, at the inauguration time, Nancy Pelosi becomes president. And that's fine with me. Let her, I think she'd be excellent until they sort it out.
That's a good note to to end this terrific program. This book is so worth reading. It is. I raced through it. I really just loved it. So good. I loved it, and I hated it, but I loved it. So thank you very much. And we so appreciate your being here, and I look forward to seeing you again at Writer's Block soon.
Well, it's nice being back.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And go to Chevalier's because they have signed book plates, everybody.
Yes, they do. I think about 100 plus of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.